Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. This is your host, Greg Howell, and I'm joined by Jim Wibberding, our fellow co-host.
I'm excited to be here and excited to talk to Gary today.
Yeah. We've got a special guest here. And I love, we were just talking here right before we started recording, how we're recording this on a particularly momentous day specific to our topic. And it's Memorial Day for us. You'll probably listen to this much past Memorial Day. But for us here in the moment, I think it's a really important thing because we have our special guest, Gary Kulik. Gary is a veteran of the American military. He's got a lot of great stories, and we invited him on today because he just wrote a fantastic book. Gary, give us a little bit of your personal background, if you could, and what book we're going to be talking about today.
The book I wrote has the in-your-face title of Conscientious Objectors at War, the Vietnam War's Forgotten Medics. I wrote the book because the library shelves groan with books about Vietnam. None of these books tell us anything about men who served as conscientious objectors in Vietnam. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Some of it, I think, just misunderstanding. The term itself connotes a kind of black and white world in which we can understand people who know anything at all about conscientious objection if they're people who sought alternative service honorably. But in my experience, there are substantial numbers of people who have no idea that men also had the choice, going before a draft board, to declare themselves conscientious objectors, that is, men unwilling to kill, but willing to serve. And this is the forgotten history that I chose to write about through the use of interviews and oral history, memoir, and it's a personal story since I, too, served as a conscientious objector medic 1970-71 in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. My story, too, and I write about that in the book, a kind of apology that I'm going to intrude myself into this book. At one level, it's an academic book. I have a PhD. I came back to finish a PhD in American history, American literature, Brown University. So in some ways, it's a simple scholarly book, but in another way, it's a very different book because my history and my commentary is in that book. The decision to serve as a CO medic was the most important moral decision I've ever made. And there's no way I could write about it without putting myself in it.
Yeah, that big discussion in how we do history is always how much of the historian goes into the narrative. Should we be the passive observer? Should we pull ourselves back and just be, completely normative in our assessment? And yet you can't. I mean, there's no way here you could be unbiased or at least even unfeeling about the topic.
Well, yeah, I think obviously it depends on what you're writing about. But in this case, yes, my voice needed to be in this book.
Makes sense. I noticed when you were writing about it in the preface, talking about that intrusion of your story into the larger narrative, I think your words were, "So be it. It's just going to be this way." And I love that. As I saw your story woven throughout the larger narrative, the other people's stories, I think that added a great deal to the narrative. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Well, let's dive right in here, Gary. Again, appreciate your background on this and the extensive work you've done. And I have to say, as I was reading through the book, this was not just a memoir from a historian who fought in Vietnam, but this was a wide scope. Your background looking at World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and up into various other places. This was a history of conscientious objection in the American military is how I kind of looked at it.
That's right. And I would have been happy to read about it.
Yeah.
I could.
You wrote the book you wanted to read.
I had to write about it instead.
Yeah.
Right.
Nice.
That's exactly what it is. A book of how over time men chose to serve in the military without killing, choosing not to kill, choosing not to carry weapons.
Yeah.
Part of the backdrop for some of our audience, those who grew up Seventh-day Adventist, is that we've often heard the story of Desmond Doss in World War II.
Of course.
Right? And that's been immortalized in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, perhaps imperfectly, but nonetheless became a pop phenomenon. And I think it might be helpful to some of our audience members to kind of understand the distinction between how it was in World War II, the terms and conditions under which Desmond Doss and others like him served, and what you experienced in Vietnam.
There's a very good documentary that was done on Doss, but I'm still not sure how it was, what sort of training he had before going off to the Pacific to do the remarkable things that he did, remarkably Medal of Honor winner, for the Vietnam era. Those of us who went before draft boards and said, I'm willing to serve but not willing to kill, and assuming the draft board agreed with you, and not all did, then you went off to basic training. And in 1954, the Army had established a dedicated basic training facility for conscientious objectors, Fort Sam Houston. It was a 6-week training program. I assume Das would have been thrown into a regular basic training program, and it would have had a great deal of difficulty in explaining why he wasn't going to go to the rifle range. The same thing had happened in World War I, where men who were willing to serve as COs ended up in basic training with everybody else being trained for the rifle range. The Army finally decided that throwing COs into regular basic training was a mistake. So let's give them their own basic training. It was the same training as anyone else would have gone through, except it was shorter and there was no rifle range. And then Fort Sam was the place where all medical training took place. So when you graduated after 6 weeks, you moved across posts to do 10 weeks of medical training. And at that point, orders came down, and the need for medics in Vietnam was overwhelming. Every infantry platoon requires one medic. Every 30 men there's a medic going out in the field with those men, and many, many more in reserve on fire bases, landing zones, base camps. So a different experience than DOS because of the way the Army had established a new training program.
Okay.
DOS understood that he would be a medic. He'd be trained as a medic. And that wasn't the case in World War I. The idea was simply if you were a non-combatant, you could be assigned anywhere, engineer, signal corps. But in the early years of World War II, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army, actually, at that point, decided that all medics, all COs would be trained as medics. And that persisted through Korea, through Vietnam.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. My grandfather was drafted and was headed to the Pacific as well. And I can remember him talking a little bit about, his training as a medic, but he said a large portion of his basic training was spent cleaning the latrines and peeling potatoes. That's kind of how he remembers early training days at that point in time.
I'm sure that's still the case today.
Yeah. So, Gary, in your background as serving as a CO, what were some of the challenges that you personally experienced in just going into the military, knowing, you've made this massive moral choice? Like you mentioned, it's one of the greatest moral choices you've made. How did you go through the process of making it? But then how much also did your experience later on affect keeping it? Because I'm sure that's something that once you're out there in the actual field, the decision is tested again, right?
Yes. Well, I write about the decision as an imperfect compromise. I was deeply opposed to the war in Vietnam, as many young men on the left, as I was then, and the draft loomed. There were certain things I was unwilling to do. I could not serve as an officer in a war I opposed. I had grown up in a military family, a family of officers. My father wasn't active duty when I was growing up, but he'd been a Marine and went into the Army Air Corps as a bombardier during World War II and remained as the Air Corps became the Air Force. He was a reserve major at the time I was making this decision, and his job was to recruit students for the Air Force Academy. His two brothers were Service Academy graduates, West Point and Annapolis. So that's my background. In any other circumstance, I would have embraced being an officer. I couldn't do that. I wasn't going to jail. I wasn't going to Canada. I had a very prickly moral conscience. I saw the National Guard in those years as principally an outlet for those with political connections to avoid service in Vietnam. I couldn't join the National Guard, even though I had a history teacher who was the chaplain of a local National Guard unit. I would get a chance to revisit my moral superiority on those issues once in basic training. Because I grew up in a military family, I was looking for ways to allow my family to save face in a way, I guess my father especially. I had no particular desire to do alternative service for 2 years, whatever that would mean. Truth be told, I was not then and not now a principled pacifist. Morally complicated, imperfect decision, and very gray in a world where there were often black and white choices. So all of that together led me to go before a draft board to say that I'm willing to serve, but I'm not going to take up a weapon. Now, your other question, of course, is it's very easy to say that in front of a draft board. There's an existential moment which happens in a war zone. I'm assigned to this orientation program. A clerk comes out from the company that I'm going to ultimately be assigned to with an M16, and he hands it to me, or he gestures that he's about to hand it to me, and I say I'm not going to take it. I'm a draft board certified conscientious objector, and the guy standing next to me, is also going to the same company. He was a medic too, and I still remember the joke. He said, "What are you going to do? Kill them with your bare hands?" But I didn't take the weapon. I remember I'm the only CO in this orientation program, and no one's hassling me. I think that was one of the questions that you raised. No one was concerned about this except the jokester. So while people were at the rifle range, I just sat and watched.
Interesting.
And the M16, as we tragically know, is a very simple weapon. And we know that because of the way it gets used. Its predecessor, its successors get used in civilian life. So I felt in extremis, I knew everything I needed to know about loading, aiming, firing the weapon. I was never faced with necessity.
Ah, that's good. Some of your discussions here, obviously, are talking about just your own personal experience. But I wanted to jump over into one that's particularly interesting for some of our Seventh-day Adventist listeners, Operation Whitecoat. And this one was mentioned here and later on in the book as a pretty interesting alternative path for some Seventh-day Adventists who were also conscientious objectors. What were your thoughts on the program? What did you yourself consider it as an option?
It was never offered as an option to those of us who were not Adventists. It was specifically for Adventists. And I don't think I even knew about it when I served. I must have heard something about it. My basic training class was divided into 2 platoons, half of whom were Adventists, half were the rest of us. I only later came to find out that the Whitecoat program had been around for quite some time, established in the 1950s, I believe, with the encouragement of the leadership of the church. And during the time that I served in basic training, there was no selection process at that time for the Whitecoat program. I later learned, only doing research, years and years later, I did research in Silver Spring. And it was only then that I discovered that the medical corps, in company with Adventist elders, would meet twice a year at Fort Sam's basic training facility and decide among the volunteers who would actually serve at in Frederick, Maryland, where the program had its origins. The program, I think, became controversial both within the church and certainly outside it. And it took on a fundamentally different meaning in the context of Vietnam. Earlier, if you chose to volunteer for the program, this was pretty much after, there was a long period after the Korean War and before Vietnam, actually not so long, but enough, that volunteering for Whitecoat while the Vietnam War was going on was a ticket out of Vietnam.
How so? What were they doing in the project?
If you volunteered, and my understanding is that as the war heated up, almost every Adventist volunteered, and that wouldn't have been the case earlier.
So this became almost like a denominational exit ramp.
It definitely was that, as long as you were willing to do what the Army Medical Corps wanted you to do.
What kinds of stuff were they asking of them?
My understanding is that you had to volunteer twice. Let me back up and say, I think what I've written about Whitecoat, I think, is fair and honest. I mean, people are basically volunteering for medical experiments.
Which already has the ring of horror to it.
Exactly.
Indeed.
had, based on everything I know, these experiments were conducted with consent on the part of the volunteer. My understanding was that you volunteered both for the program, the White Coat program, and you had to also volunteer for the experiments. And there's anecdotal evidence that some people went through their 2 years without ever being exposed to any experimental treatments. The experiments were designed to assist the medical corps in preventing illness in defensive measure.
So they're taking medicines that are supposed to help, supposed to heal, but they're just testing them out quicker than perhaps the FDA process today.
I don't think you could do this today.
Yeah, I was going to say, this does not sound like it would pass muster on a couple of different areas.
I think there's still queasiness. But it's interesting to me that the White Coats are the only COs who have gathered after the fact. And, there are documentaries that suggest that many of them were proud of their service, would do it again, had no adverse effects as a result of that. There are medical studies that suggest that. I think I wanted to write about it in a way that was not sensational and that used whatever evidence I could find to suggest that there's very limited evidence of people with prolonged sicknesses as a result of that. The people who served as White Coats who gathered together a few years ago, and there was a documentary about that. That's I'm sure that it's been seen widely in Adventist churches. It's a largely positive one. However, it's still queasy making, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, instantly my head goes to, are they testing Agent Orange on these guys? Like, what are we looking at? But you mentioned this is not an offensive nature test. It's a defensive and a fixing. Yeah.
Well, that was the call.
I'd be interested to pick up on the Operation White Coat and ask you a broader thematic question here. First of all, my father-in-law, Stan Oakes, was a participant in Operation White Coat. For him, it was religious reasons. And before him, my grandfather, Dr. Jack Elvin, was in World War II, and he was a medic and also served in that capacity for religious reasons. And that's really, within the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, that's a major part of that, even though, as you note, I think accurately in your book, Seventh-day Adventists are not among the group of peace religions, but there's still this strain, this underlying idea. And that started very early, which you also mentioned in the book. 1864, we have the conference leaders sending a letter to the governor of Michigan expressing support for the North in the Civil War, but asking for opportunity for exemption based on 2 commandments, the Sabbath, and so the 4th and the 6th commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, this has been, when we talk about conscientious objection, it's a religious thing. It was interesting to read your book and read about a California pantheist, which is a religious perspective. And then was it United States versus Seeger in 1965 that broadened it beyond religious objections? I'm curious about that aspect.
The 65 decision basically broadened the definition of what it meant to believe in a supreme being.
Okay.
And it opened up the possibility that religious training and belief, which was written into the law, could be broadened to include ethical training and belief. Not every draft board got the message, but certainly as the war wore on, as it became very controversial, increasing numbers of men made their claims in a non-traditional religious way, an ethical way. But in my experience, the overwhelming majority of men, obviously, the huge number of Adventists were there for a deep belief, as you say, in Sabbath keeping and thou shalt not kill. But I also found that men who were coming from other traditions were also making religious claims. And so I think the story is basically a religious one. And the men I went through training with were deeply committed Christians. These were people who had absorbed the Gospels.
Your Quakers, your Mennonites, the Christians who have a pacifist background largely, or even just in general. I'm just guess I'm kind of wondering how many of these COs are riding on a tradition of pacifism within their denominations, and how many of them are just coming to this in their own moment.
I think if you're talking about the people coming out of traditional peace churches, the Friends, Mennonites, Moravians, these were people who far more likely, I didn't encounter these folks in the military. These were people far more likely to claim alternative service and have no problem with it because that's what their churches had long believed. They're coming out of that background.
They're taught that. It's a major discussion point within their churches. Yeah.
Right. And this was not controversial. If you were a Quaker, you went before a draft board and you said, I can't serve in the military, period. You would end up doing alternative service. The Christian people I served with came out of churches that had just war doctrine. Catholics, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists.
Mm-hmm.
And, they found their way with the support of the churches. Every major Protestant church, mainstream Protestant churches, as well as the Roman Catholic Church, supported the idea that their members could be conscientious objectors.
Mm-hmm.
That was their understanding of the gospel.
Interesting.
So there was widespread support, but it was very different than if you came up in a traditional peace church, and especially different for Seventh-day Adventists who there was a medical cadet corps that you could enroll in high school, which gave you a head start on basic training at Fort Sam.
Yeah. Now, this is a lot of nuances in your work here, and one of them that I was particularly interested in was really a central contribution of your book, and that is your chapter on historical background to non-combatant service. I haven't seen anything like that before. And then, of course, your larger book illustrates it well. As you surveyed the development of CO service through time, what were some of the surprises, perhaps? Or if there were no surprises for you as a well-studied historian, what are some of the highlights that you want to share with your readers?
That's a good question. Let me think for a bit. I think one of the surprises was that in World War II, there was a much higher percentage of people willing to serve in non-combatant roles than were willing to serve in alternative service. And that surprised me. But part of the reason for that is that alternative service was sharply defined, especially in the early years of World War II. The expectation was that you would go to one of the civilian conservation corps camps and do forestry work. And so instead of having an option of working in a hospital or a mental health clinic, which became possible during the Vietnam War era, you were channeled into this forestry program. There were some exceptions, but there was a heavy emphasis that we're just going to put all these people together in these former CCC camps, and we're going to send them out to do forestry related work. This created a lot of tension, particularly among the Quakers, who thought this was a waste of time. I mean, let me do something that was more meaningful. And I think for that reason, it became an unattractive alternative for people. And the most prominent conscientious objector during World War II was an actor named Lew Ayres. Lew Ayres won his fame by he was the lead actor in All Quiet on the Western Front, the first version of that movie. And he was a kind of self-taught, didn't go to college, seeker. And so there was a short biography of him, which I read and I note in the book, that he was assigned to one of these camps and just hated it and decided, I want to do something else. I'd rather serve, and so he made the decision to serve honorably as a medic, and I think spent some time as a chaplain's assistant as well in the Pacific. So that was surprising to me.
I've just started to think about this. I've noticed that the more recent generations are perhaps less inclined to simply follow whatever the denomination has stipulated. There's a lot more independent thinking. If somebody's going in as a CO, they may claim it, because that's what their church believes, or they just may claim it as what they believe. How do you think the military has handled that? There's paperwork that needs to come from the denomination saying, yes, this is an official belief of ours, but that's going to kind of adjust and change over the years. What does CO status entail And how did it kind of grow with that change in social dynamics?
I'm not sure I understand the question because, I mean, once the draft was over, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't matter anymore. I think for Adventists, there's some evidence. I ran across this in the archives at Silver Spring. As the war wound on, there were students at, I believe, was it Columbia Union? Is that the college?
It used to be, yeah. Now it's Washington Adventist University, but yeah.
Washington Adventist, who were recorded as saying, why are we supposed to serve as on our medics? Why, why can't we be? Why can't we serve? Why can't we do alternative service? There was that criticism. Those students are beginning to be influenced by the anti-war movement and challenging the tradition of the church. And of course, there were Adventists who opted simply to enlist. I'll tell you a story. My second assignment in Vietnam was to helicopter medevac evacuation battalion. And I had a very good experience with a man named Ernie Sylvester. He was a major at that time. He was the chief operations officer for the battalion, a pilot. And it turns out I knew none of this at the time, except I liked and respected him. He was on his second tour. I think I knew that. But what I didn't know is that he was, in effect, there at the beginning of this program to establish Army helicopter evacuation. And there's a Hall of Fame for those folks, and he's in it. And I was at a conference some years ago, just a few years ago in San Antonio, and there's Ernie suffering from Parkinson's, I thought at the time, on this monitor talking about early helicopter evacuation. Well, I had so much respect for him as an officer that I wanted to find out a little bit more. And he ended up in a retirement community in Florida. I found his obituary. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. He'd made a choice to do something that would help save people's lives without declaring himself a conscientious objector.
Mm-hmm.
As an officer, he would have had to go through weapons training. There was no way around that. But that struck me as here's a man I had deep respect for. Didn't know he was an Adventist, but it made all of it made sense. So those were choices available to people who came out of the Adventist tradition as well. Ernie was a great example of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's kind of why I brought the question up, because I know in my own family, my grandfather claimed CEO status, was headed to the Pacific as a medic, as was typical, but his cousin Esley was not. Esley just enlisted and became basic infantry in the Black Forest,
Mm-hmm.
And their experience coming home was what was interesting. Grandpa, though he actually only got on the boat, they were just about to depart from into the Pacific, and then they were told, get off the boat, go back to the barracks, we just dropped the bomb. So Grandpa never saw, any moment for his medical training to be used. Uncle Esley fought all the way through the last couple of years and even stayed over in the cleanup and the reconstruction. Esley comes home and is treated pretty poorly, while Grandpa, who saw no action, is lauded as a hero, at least in the local churches and the family. In fact, I remember Uncle Esley is kind of the black sheep of the family, and largely after listening a little bit to it, it was because of how they enlisted and what they claimed when they went in. It's an interesting background, and this is kind of where I want to bring out the last couple of questions here. What do you think the experience for these CEOs coming home? What are you seeing in their stories? You mentioned a lot of PTSD and some, survivor's guilt, perhaps, that's also coming with that. But as religious figures here who, have taken their stand and are now coming back to it, what do you think was the experience for some of these guys on the way home?
I don't think there's a typical experience. I interviewed two people very like myself, I think, who came out of a Roman Catholic background, both still really angry about the war and guilty, deeply, deeply guilty about it. And in fact, I think the two chapters I wrote on those two men are among the stronger chapters in the book, if I can say that myself.
No, I agree.
Stronger in the sense that I didn't understand it. And I inserted myself into their stories. But both served as CO medics and came back feeling that they couldn't extricate themselves from the guilt associated with the war.
Hmm.
And that surprised me. That surprised me a lot.
Did they try to explain that, or was it just like this overwhelming guilt feeling?
I think it was just this powerful sense of guilt. They were part of the destruction. But um, it's hard now to find anything worthy about service in Vietnam. It's very difficult, even though I went to great lengths to make sure that I didn't want to fall into that. I didn't want to fall into that kind of despair. But I had to be honest as well. I mean, the war was a mistake.
Hmm.
We had no business sending ground troops into Vietnam. It made a bloody civil war even worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the two people I wrote about went on to in some ways, distinguish professional careers. One became a very important poet, the other an important newspaper man. And they came home to a culture that saw nothing valuable about Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned Paquette here, and I found it was interesting that his CO status was granted based on his Christian perspective and his Christian teaching, which you mentioned is kind of broadening the definition for that religious belief system as it was. For you yourself, coming back home, how did the CO experience inform your later career choices and decisions?
My career choices had been made before I was drafted.
So you already had a trajectory.
Yeah. I think it took me a long time to even think deeply about Vietnam. I just wanted to put it behind me and get on with the career I had started. I was drafted out of Brown University after my first year in graduate school. And I went back I can't say as if nothing had happened, but I went back fully embracing what I had started and pushing Vietnam into the background.
Yeah. Is that largely just your own impetus, or is that also impacted by the reception, of veterans coming home from that war, particularly anyway?
I think I wrote about this in my first book. I'm back at Brown. I'm at a lunch. So I tell people that I served in Vietnam as a conscientious objector, and there's a short, very smarmy history graduate student sitting across from me who basically says, there were easier options.
A little judgmental there.
And I'm registering this as a kind of spit.
Mm-hmm.
And the easier option for him was to fake a medical deferment. He was a very short guy, and apparently he gorged himself before his physical so that he'd be overweight in terms of his height. And of all the options, of all the choices that people made to avoid service in Vietnam, this is, I think, the vilest. The con of the medical deferment. And I write about this briefly in the conclusion of this new book. I just couldn't see it. I mean, there's something deeply inauthentic. Conscience has a cost.
Which is kind of why you describe at the beginning an imperfect compromise.
An imperfect compromise, but one that I paid a cost for.
No doubt.
I mean, people who wanted to manipulate a doctor's diagnosis, or I just found it repulsive. So
Yeah.
Well, the truth of the matter is that I finished my PhD. I did a good bit of what I wanted to do. I edited an important scholarly journal for a time, American Quarterly. I had university teaching posts, but I did most of my work in museums and management positions at the Smithsonian and later in a large museum in Delaware. And the truth is, I began writing about Vietnam because in my second job in Delaware, I was increasingly unhappy in the job. The board, I was very senior, and the board was moving in directions that I couldn't support. And eventually I resigned. But it took me a while to get to that resignation. Recognizing my unhappiness while I was still in the job, my wife said, "You need a project." And so the project became my first book, and on Vietnam, on the war. And that just continued, even as I happily left my job and I found a kind of new career. My early research wasn't on anything related to foreign policy or military history. But this, I found a certain pleasure in doing this, and I hope it leads to more work. This is a thin book that I hope can inspire others to go deeper into the whole story of conscientious objection during the war. At this point, there's no history of overall conscientious objection. The alternative service people haven't been favored either. We don't know much about that process.
It's a lot of work to be done here.
It's a seminal work in that sense because I haven't seen this much detail put into this particular area. So no, it's fantastic.
Yeah. We're about to wind down our conversation, but I do want to get a question in before we do. And it has to do with that ethical moral tension that you describe. One of the takeaways from reading your book is that kind of murkiness of the decision-making process for many COs. It's not ethically or morally clear in the way that some of the triumphalist narratives have presented it. And I've often felt this tension as I think about the Adventist tradition. You have the Civil War, you have the leaders supporting the North in the war and banding together to pay the $300 for exemption. And you get to some of the later wars, World War I, there's a show of patriotism because Adventists are under scrutiny since they don't want to fight in the war. So you kind of support, but don't. Then you have World War II, and Adventists by that time had developed the 47th General Hospital, which was a deployable division of the Adventist Church to be used by the War Department. And you get to Operation Whitecoat and all this. And in the midst of all this, the question that always comes forward is, yes, you choose not to kill, but you're part of the killing machine. I think that comes through at several moments in your narrative. What I'm curious about is how writing this book, doing the research, has perhaps helped you along, or how has it affected you in processing your own historical choice and how you've related to all that?
I think I'm a person who can live comfortably with ambiguity.
Mm.
And I think writing about the grayness of my choice was in some sense simply writing about what it means to be human.
Mm.
I mean, the idea of, perfect, there are no perfect decisions. I suppose that was what made it difficult for me to quite understand the sense of pervasive guilt that my two fellow COs who came out of the Catholic tradition left the war with. I have no sense of guilt about what I did in Vietnam. I feel that I acted honorably, but I recognize the decision was imperfect. It was a compromise. It doesn't trouble me. I'm not sure it ever did. It has much to do with, the quirks of human personality.
I wonder if for those other fellows, I obviously didn't know them or anything, but perhaps there was this unspoken expectation that their decision to take on CO status would have somewhat, assuaged the guilt that they feared would come with something else. And then in the ultimate reality, perhaps that's not what happened.
Oh, no, I think, again, the nature of the war itself really wore on people who were making a decision because they opposed not only killing, they opposed the war. So yeah, they went to a war that many of their fellow citizens regard as immoral. So that can weigh heavily on consciences, fragile consciences.
Really appreciate your answer to that question, because the world is gray, and narratives that preserve the grayness are more helpful in processing present day decisions.
Yeah. No, Gary, I want to say thank you on several different levels. For one, just honoring us to come on the podcast and discuss your book. Again, a fantastic book. I'm just kind of looking at the overall details of that, but also just thank you for your service. Thank you for the ability to take that moral ambiguity, to move forward in your own life with it, and then be able to share it in a powerful way. So on several different levels, thank you so much for being here with us. And folks, if you're just listening in here for the first time, welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. You've had a chance here to hear a moment in history, both from someone who has served, but also who has dug into the stories of those others who have served in this moment. But again, Gary, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you both for inviting me. Thank you both for your probing and thoughtful questions. This has been a good experience for me, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this. And I have an abiding respect for the Adventists that I knew in basic training, and I hope that this story, especially for Adventist history, becomes better known.
Yeah, amen to that. Well, thank you again, and thank you for coming on Memorial Day. Happy Memorial Day to you.
My privilege.